All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're systematically dissecting the South China Sea dispute to really optimize your conceptual clarity and strategic understanding. This is a dense, high-retention strategic briefing designed to cover all the crucial facts, treaties, and geopolitical implications without missing a beat. We've got a packed agenda today, covering 6 key areas: the core territorial dispute, stakeholders and strategic motivations, the geopolitics, security and economy, UNCOLS and the legal dimensions, India's strategic calculus, and finally, a look at the future outlook with a rapid revision recap. Starting with Section 1, the core territorial dispute, looking specifically at the geography and the triggers. So what are we actually dealing with here? We're looking at a 3 million square kilometer region that acts as a massive global economic choke point. To put that into perspective, literally 1/3 of all global maritime shipping passes right through these waters. That's $3 trillion in trade every single year. And beneath the surface, we're talking about huge unexploited hydrocarbon reserves, an estimated 14 trillion barrels of natural gas, and roughly 16 to 33 billion barrels of unexplored oil. Basically, whoever controls key geographies like the Paracel Islands, the Spratly Islands, and the Scarborough Shoal, well, they effectively control the economic arteries of Asia. Now, the fundamental root cause of this entire crisis traces back to one specific thing: China's 1949 nine-dash line. It was essentially just a loosely marked map claiming historical rights over almost the entire sea. Now, even though it had absolutely zero basis in international maritime law, this one document is the root cause of all the overlapping territorial disputes we see today. When you look at China's escalation ladder, there's a very clear chronological strategy at play here. It kicks off with that initial 1949 claim, then escalates to denying access, like when they seized the Scarborough Shoal back in 2012. After that, they physically manifest power by militarizing artificial islands, specifically the Fiery Cross Reef bases. And finally, they institutionalize that control with the highly aggressive 2021 Coast Guard law, which basically authorizes all necessary means to enforce their jurisdiction.
Moving on to Section 2, stakeholders and strategic motivations, focusing on the actors and their objectives.
If you map out the stakeholders, the complexity is just intense. Take a look at the Paracel Islands. That dispute is mostly a bilateral issue between China and Vietnam. But the Spratly Islands, that is a massively fragmented geopolitical flashpoint. You've got China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei all asserting overlapping claims based on their exclusive economic zones. With this many players, reaching any kind of consensus is incredibly difficult. Now, to understand the hidden strategic motivations behind all these claims, you absolutely need to lock this concept into your memory: the Malacca Dilemma. China relies heavily on West Asia for its energy needs, and those critical sea lanes of communication pass right through very narrow geographic choke points, specifically the Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok Straits. The fear here is that in a conflict, adversaries could easily blockade these straits, which would instantly cripple the Chinese economy. So, linking that geopolitics directly to security, what are China's core strategic objectives? First, by dominating the South China Sea, Beijing wants to bypass that Malacca Dilemma entirely. To do this, they have to transform the PLA Navy into a true blue water navy. Securing these waters also means locking down those immense energy reserves. Remember, 7 billion barrels of oil and 900 trillion cubic feet of gas. Ultimately, the broader goal is to dominate the Indo-Pacific and counter the USA's pivot to Asia policy by pushing US forces out of the region. That brings us to Section 3, geopolitics, security, and economy, looking at the escalation landscape. When we talk about security implications, a major issue is the rapid militarization of partially submerged reefs. The critical metric to remember here is 3,000 meters. That is the length of the massive runway they constructed on the 27-acre Fiery Cross Reef. This one piece of infrastructure can facilitate operations for pretty much all of China's combat aircraft, which permanently alters the military reality on the ground. Because of this infrastructure, China has unprecedented power projection across the disputed zone. We're now looking at 20 military outposts in the Paracels and 7 heavily militarized outposts in the Spratlys. This physical dominance is severely exacerbating geopolitical tensions. Take the recent confrontations at the Second Thomas Shoal, for example, where China blocked the resupply of the grounded Philippine ship, the Sierra Madre. Plus, there's a constant Coast Guard presence dominating Scarborough Shoal. The real danger here: these localized clashes could easily escalate and inadvertently trigger the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. Let's pivot to Section 4, UNCLOS and legal dimensions, examining the institutional frameworks. If we trace the legal timeline, the foundation is the 1982 UN Close Agreement, the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea. Fast forward to 2002, ASEAN and China decided to finalize a code of conduct. But, well, progress totally stalled. That led the Philippines to take things to international courts in 2013. And now, thanks to all these escalating clashes, there's a new looming deadline set for 2026 to finally get that ASEAN-China code of conduct sorted out. But here's a massive institutional failure you need to note. In July 2016, a landmark Hague arbitral tribunal verdict completely invalidated China's historic claims under the 9-line. But because the ruling is legally unenforceable, the PRC just completely ignores it. They insist on bilateral negotiations and flat out refuse to adhere to international maritime law. All right, Section 5, India's strategic calculus, focusing on the Act East policy and strategic balance. When you juxtapose India's constraints and responses against China's actions, the contrast is stark. While China is pushing an expansionist regime, making unilateral territorial claims and restricting maritime access, India's core stance is all about protecting the global commons. New Delhi is anchored in its Act East policy, aggressively demanding freedom of navigation under UN clause and working hard to restore regional maritime balance against these growing power asymmetries.
From an economic and geopolitical standpoint, any disruption to free trade in these eastern commons directly threatens India's own economic trajectory. India is rapidly deepening its trade and economic linkages in the Pacific, so New Delhi views these Southeast Asian littorals as a real litmus test for international maritime law. Respecting the Hague Tribunal's verdict isn't just about playing by the rules, it's a strategic imperative to counter power asymmetries in maritime Asia and ensure a multipolar Indo-Pacific.
And finally, Section 6, Future Outlook and Revision, covering the path forward in our rapid revision cheat sheet. Looking ahead, we are dealing with a highly volatile causal chain. First, you have states asserting their rights, like the under-equipped Philippines Coast Guard cutting China's floating barrier at Scarborough Shoal. In response, China forcefully enforces its jurisdiction using that 2021 Coast Guard law. This inevitably creates direct escalation points, like the naval clashes at 2nd Thomas Shoal. The absolute worst-case systemic risk here is treaty activation, where the United States becomes legally bound to intervene. Okay, let's lock this into memory with a rapid revision recap. Treaties, 1982 UNLCOS is your foundation, and 2026 is the critical deadline for the Code of Conduct. For disputed zones, remember the Paracel Islands are a 2-party dispute, while the Spratlys are a complex 6-party flashpoint. Key terms you absolutely must know: the Malacca Dilemma, the push for a blue water navy, and the 1949 9-line. And for India's stance, it's all about securing the Act East policy through strict compliance with the Hague Tribunal. We'll wrap up this explainer with a vital strategic question to think about. As that 2026 deadline for a unified code of conduct rapidly approaches, will international law and UN clause successfully govern the global commons? Or has relentless militarization permanently altered the map, turning the South China Sea into an irreversible expansionist military fortress? Keep these frameworks top of mind as events continue to unfold.